I use the word I welcome the opportunity, but welcome is not the word when we're talking about this topic. And I wish, Ceann Comhairle, that we would have this down on a regular basis for monitoring the implementation of the third strategy and an implementation discussion as opposed to statements. I have made statements continuously since 2016, over and over. I acknowledge that progress has been made. I acknowledge theoretically that the third national strategy finally was published. But as always, I look back, and I have before me, Minister, and it's worth looking at it really. I'll start with just the finance that appeals to the male mind, I think, more than the female mind. But the national estimate, Safe Ireland, in conjunction with Galway, the national estimate cost of violence, domestic violence, is in a 20-and-a-half-year period is 56 billion. 56 billion. I found it hard to credit myself. Hospitalisation, loss of productivity, all set out clearly over and over again over a 20-and-a-half-year period. So I often make the point, even on an economic level, which in the context of what we're discussing and the horrific figures is not funny really, but that's the cost at a conservative estimate. So we're looking at the results of the first ever CSO survey published on the 19th of April. And I understand it's part of a series of publications between April and July of this year, and then over the next 5 years. It's the largest examination of the issue of sexual violence in the state, with over 4,500 participants between May and December of last year. Now, I welcome the updated figures, but again, as usual, I want to put this in perspective. It's now over 21 years, and 21 years is usually the age when we get sense. In the past, it was the year we got to vote. And I would think that any government, and not just your government, Minister, but any government, has to look at 21 years later, what have we been told? It's 21 years since the SAVI, the Sexual Abuse and Violence in Ireland, published in January 2002. And when I was rereading it, I realised that it was a play on the word SAVI, Sexual Assault and Violence in Ireland, but also savvy in relation to being savvy about the statistics and the extent of the violence. And I had forgotten that. In the 21 years since then, 180 women have died violently in Ireland. 181 women. And this recent survey from the CSO shows that very little has improved in terms of sexual violence prevalence since SAVI, meaning that efforts at reducing sexual violence have not been effective. Now, I'll come back to that in a minute. I think I'm stopping 3 for you. I beg your pardon. But the fact that 21 years were elapsed before any research were done is truly shocking. Now, I and my colleagues have stood up on this side of the House repeatedly and begged for the SAVI to be updated. In fact, I'm going to come to one of the original authors, Dr. Hannah McGee, in relation to it. And one of their recommendations, recommendation 7 of 8, was that there would be ongoing research. Of course, it never happened. And when she looked at these figures in relation to the CSO, and she acknowledged there were caveats in comparing the two sets of statistics, but there is a huge communality in relation to the prevalence of violence and sexual abuse in our country. And it should be said, mostly by people that are known to the victims. And that's very important, given the wider discussion, or not the absence of discussion that's going on outside the Dáil in relation to fear of strangers. She says the 22, I'm not going to quote Dr. Hannah McGee because she was one of the original authors 21 years ago. She said the 2022 figures are shocking. Half of adult women and more than a quarter of adult men reported a lifetime exposure to sexual violence, yet almost 47% of women and 3/4 of men did not disclose these experiences to anyone. Because I'm conscious of time, I'm not going to go into they're here on the record and we're all aware of them. But going back to SAVI, she says, having collected the voices and the stories at the time, which was groundbreaking research, 3,120 women and men sharing their experience back then, she said, I cannot look back at what those statistics tell now. Whatever the statistical caveats, they tell me that not much, if anything, has changed for the better in 21 years. Sexual violence is an iceberg, huge and hidden, and we need a serious national dialogue to figure out how to change it. That's Professor Hannah McGee, Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Academic Affairs at the RCSI University of Medicine. That's what she's telling us. And then if we look at going back, the year my second son was born, report of the Task Force on Violence Against Women, forwarded by Etna Fitzgerald. Remember Etna Fitzgerald? And she sets out the task force aim is to ensure women's experienced violence have real options. And she talks about programmes for men and perpetrators. 1997, they set out recommendations, nothing happened. And she talks about the injustice, the reporters of the perpetrator staying in the house and the victim having to leave the house. And again, nothing much has changed in relation to that. And we look at the homicide. We still haven't got the promised report on the homicides. No report on that. We still have no report on the bill that was brought in, the Sexual Offences Act in 2017. No report available. Same person doing both, which was absolutely madness in my opinion, and we're still waiting. Such is the lack of value we place on women's affairs. Sinead Gibney, Chief Commissioner of the IHREC, she said, in January of this year, Minister, violence against women has reached crisis. I'll stick to her exact words, has reached crisis levels in Ireland. So my time is finishing. I'm not here to lambaste. I'm here to highlight that violence is endemic and we as a society have failed to deal with it on any level, notwithstanding the wonderful strategies, notwithstanding the wonderful promises. And there's just the tip of the iceberg in relation to the reports to date. And we're committing to doubling the number of refugees. That's after sustained pressure where is it 9 or 12 counties have none, and also we're still not complying with our obligations under the Istanbul Convention.
Thank you.